A very good morning, everyone. I, on behalf of the Shastra fraternity, welcome you all to the 17th CUB Shri V. Narayanan Memorial Lecture. We start today's event with the invocation, and I call upon stage Ms. Krishnaja, a research scholar from the School of Law, and I request all of you to kindly rise for the same.
Maitrim bhajata akhila hrijetri. Maitrim bhajata akhila hrijetri. Atmavadeva paranapi pashyata. Atmavadeva paranapi pashyata. Yuddham tyajata Spardham tyajata, yuddham tyajata, spardham tyajata, tyajata paresha kramamakramanam. Tyajata paresha kramamakramanam. Maitrim bhajata akhila hrijetri. Janani prithvi kamaduhaste. Janani prithvi kamaduhaste. Janako devah sakala dayalo. Janako devah sakala dayalo. Dhamya dadatta Dhayatvam janata dhamya dadatta Dhayatvam janata Shreyod bhuyat sakala jananam Shreyod bhuyat sakala jananam Shreyod bhuyat sakala jananam Shreyod bhuyat sakala jananam Shreyod bhuyat sakala jananam.
Thank you, everyone. I now request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Xvii Subramaniam, to welcome the eminent gathering.
Distinguished speaker for this 17th City Union Bank Shri V. Narayanan Memorial Lecture, Dr. Anantha Nageshwaran, Dr. Kamakoti, Managing Director of City Union Bank, the members of the board of the City Union Bank, the Chancellor of the University, other executives from the bank, special invitees, Mrs. Anantha Nageshwaran, my faculty colleagues, student friends from the School of Law, Management, and other disciplines who have come here on your own interest, friends from the print and the electronic media. A very good morning to all of you. And once again, I'm extremely happy to welcome you for this 17th Shri V. Narayanan Memorial Lecture that Shastra is organizing in memory of one of the distinguished sons of the soil who established the City Union Bank, or rather one of the prime movers of the City Union Bank, whose unseen presence the bank still sees today. And as part of the welcome address, I thought I will first speak a few words about the person in whose honor we are having this lecture and the person who is delivering the lecture. And secondly, the topic on which this lecture is going to be delivered. And I distinctly remember, and I'm sure Dr. Ananta also recalls his visit in 2017 in the very same campus, but in a different building, where we had one session only on banks. And that time we had a very intellectually engaging debate on large-sized banks, small-sized banks, and there were theories that big banks can never fail. I mean, there were a lot of theories that surrounded the way in which banks have to size themselves based on the responsibilities that they undertake, and how countries have to also frame policies when it comes to banks of different sizes. But then today, looking at what happened to SVB in the last week, anyway, that's not going to be the topic for discussion today. But since this lecture is in honor of a person who was responsible for building a bank with a vision that is very unique, and this bank, I wouldn't say it's a large size bank, and at the same time, I wouldn't say it is a small bank. And that's why I always feel that City Union Bank is a right-sized bank, because it produces the right type of individuals and institutions who have been contributing for the larger cause of creating and enriching the socio-economic capital of not only this particular geography of this nation, but also spreading its presence across India. On that count, it is so relevant that at this point of time that we organize this lecture in honor of Mr. Narayanan, whose unseen presence the bank always sees today. And he was the one who did not believe in many of these formally recognized rating institutions, their credit rating reports. And that's why we always feel that he is the person who lived to the present City Union Bank's coinage. Most of you would recall their advertisements that says, Easiana Bank, Rasiana Bank. And they have made banking so easy. And they have made every customer feel that the moment they engage with City Union Bank, then they are destined to be successful in whatever pursuits that they undertake. And that's the DNA that runs through the bank, right from the leadership up to the last level of workforce, and also spreading to a certain extent to its other stakeholder community, more importantly, the customers of the bank. And that's the type of spirit with which the bank is still today functioning. And Shastra University is very happy to organize this lecture, because City Union Bank was one of the banks that stood with the institution right from the formative stages and still stands today. And we consider City Union Bank as our partner in progress of this institution. So that's the reason we every year organize this lecture in memory of the legendary banker. And to the person who is here to deliver this lecture, I already told you he was here 6 years back when we had a special session on banks, and his lecture still is fresh in my memories, because he's a person who has a unique way of handling a topic. And I felt when I shared the topic with him that it is the economic thoughts in Vasudeva Kudumbakam, that I was giving him an abstract topic, but I know that he has the capacity to convert an abstract topic into a concrete speech. And I'm sure I join all of you with full eagerness to listen to Dr. Ananta Nageshwaran, who by himself is a very distinguished personality, graduated not very far away from this place, from the American College in Madurai, later did his management in IIM Bangalore and went on to complete his PhD in University of Massachusetts. And then his career was fully in the banking ecosystem. And he is a scholar banker, I should say, with specialized skills in exchange rate currency modeling. He worked for the UBS and later with Credit Suisse, and writes extensively And I've read most of his articles for Mint and Swarajya for a very long period of time before he occupied this very distinguished post as the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. And it gives me great pleasure, sir, to welcome you on behalf of Shastra and also on behalf of City Union Bank. And the topic we have today, and as I already mentioned, I am also one amongst you waiting in full eagerness to listen to what Dr. Ananta, or Dr. Van, as we usually call him, is going to talk about the topic on the economic thoughts in Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam. But I thought I will just leave a very small backdrop. When he assumed the office as the Chief Economic Advisor last year, I still distinctly remember, I just called him the day before he assumed the office and I wished him well to present the economic survey that year. So he was saying that, I'm just going to read a speech that is already prepared because he just joined a couple of days before the economic survey was presented. So that was the year where the economic survey adopted the author for the economic survey. But this year, what he presented was an economic survey authored by the Chief Economic Advisor himself. And as students, you should know that the economic survey is actually a data mine. Unfortunately, it comes one day before the union budget, and union budget actually carries away all the media, print space, electronic media space, everything. And very little people talk about the economic survey. Actually, it has to be the other way. The economic survey actually has a lot of data because the economic survey reflects the mood of the nation, the Indian nation. The union budget reflects the mood of the Indian government, but that can change. But the mood of the nation is permanent. And that's why, the economic survey is a very, very important instrument that students and faculty have to spend a lot of time in understanding what it has in it and what's the type of information that is available, which actually provides different types of empirical evidence on which you can do outstanding research. And I'm just going to give you 2 data points with which I will conclude my welcome address. Your predecessor, Mr. Shankaracharya, did a very interesting study. He found that the per capita income, the per capita expenditure, and per capita savings over a time period from 1993 up to 2007. And those were the times after the Narasimha Rao government embarked on this liberalization policy. Those were the formative stages of a very prosperous Indian economy. And he actually compared the per capita income, expenditure, and savings of India for the last 15 years and found a very astounding statistic that as the per capita income increased, which was natural because those were the times that we started becoming really prosperous, the per capita expenditure also started increasing because people started consuming. And the per capita saving was also increasing because the income was also increasing. But during turbulent times, he also noticed one thing, that as the per capita income, the rate at which the per capita income started increasing, and during the turbulent times, the per capita expenditure in terms of the absolute value started increasing. But the per capita savings, the households were able to so tactfully handle that to ensure that as a percentage, as absolute value, it remains same, as a result of which it could internally adjust itself. The rate at which the per capita savings increased was actually faster than the per capita income and per capita expenditure, which was an economic phenomenon that was very unique for the Indian household. But the last 2 years data shows a small dip in the per capita savings, or savings as a percentage of GDP. Quite understandably, post-pandemic, there was a lot of consumption that is happening, which is also good. But overall, the way in which the household, and this you had also reflected in your economic survey recently, how the household percentage debt versus GDP is also at reasonable levels. And as a nation, we have been able to calibrate. That's the second part I wanted to also showcase, is from the recent economic survey, how as a nation, both the all the household, the private, non-finance private, as well as government, all debt put together as a percent of GDP is still at manageable levels when we compare it with other nations which have actually between 2008 and 2022 is what you did your comparison, they have just breached all limits. And I jocularly say, yesterday there was a discussion after this Xvii, I'm sure you would also notice that, whether the debt levels have to now further be increased and the US has to get permission from the Congress. And there were times when the salaries were not paid. This was 4 years back when debt levels were so high. There was this joke that always keeps doing the round. If garbage or if your sewerage enters your house, and a sane person will want to suck out the drain water. No, but for somebody who wants to again increase the level of debt, there will be a policy advice saying that please raise the level of the ceiling and allow more sewer. So you keep on allowing more debt by raising the bar. It's just, fixing a problem for a temporary period of time, but then the problem will start coming back. So these are the two data points that I wanted to share with you. One was Mr. Shankaracharya's analysis of how households behave over an economic period that almost covered a very wide spectrum of economic life cycle. And secondly, the calibrated levels of debt that as a nation we handle. And these two, at an individual level and at institutional level, has definitely given us a lot of lessons. And are these lessons only for us? Is it only for Indian academia, Indian corporates, Indian society? I think the time has come that we should also draw these lessons from the way in which individuals and institutions behave, and also tell to the world that there are certain points that have to be discussed, deliberated at length, and the success or the reasonable level of progress that we as a country we are able to make, we have something to tell to the world. And that solution is not only solution to India's problems, for all that we know, it could also be solutions to regional problems or to global problems as well. It is with that perspective, that background, that I had requested Dr. Van to talk on the topic, the economic thoughts in Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam, because now we live in a period of time where the entire world is intertwined multidimensionally, and that any decision that comes out of the Indian soil will have global effects as well. So it is with that perspective that I had requested the speaker for this morning session to talk on the topic economic thoughts in Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam. With this brief backdrop, I welcome all of you for the 17th City Union Bank Shri V. Narayanan Memorial Lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I request our Honorable Vice Chancellor to felicitate our chief guest with a token of our gratitude and appreciation. I request Shri M. Narayanan, Chairman, City Union Bank, to felicitate our chief guest. On behalf of City Union Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my extreme privilege and honor to request Dr. V. Ananthanageshwaran, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, to deliver the 17th CUB Shri V. Narayanan Memorial Lecture. Please, sir.
Shri Seturaman sir, Mr. Narayanan, Chairperson of City Union Bank, Dr. Vaidya Subramaniam, Vice Chancellor of Shastra University, Dr. Kamakodi, Managing Director of City Union Bank, distinguished members of the Board of Directors of the City Union Bank, esteemed faculty members, officials, and my dear students. I wish you all a very good morning. It is indeed my pleasure, privilege, and I'm humbled by the opportunity given to me to deliver the 17th Shri Narayanan Memorial Lecture. I must say, but listening to Dr. Vaidya, probably I should have let him deliver this lecture and listened to him. Because I don't think even my own officers have read the survey so minutely and so correctly as he has done. And the analogy he used to describe the situation in the developed countries, whereby if there is a sewage leakage or seepage into the house, do you drain it out or do you raise the ceiling to let more sewage come into the house? It's a very apt way of characterizing the problem that the developed societies face today. In fact, I used to use a different analogy, and I find this much more appropriate and more effective what he said. I used to say that the Western societies have adopted the practice of, if a disease exists, the purpose of the medicine that they have decided to use is not to eradicate the disease, but to intensify the disease even further. That's exactly what he described. So that is why I feel he should have been the appropriate person to deliver this lecture. I'm sure you will make a note, Dr. Kamakodi, for the 18th memorial lecture. So, Shri V. Narayanan, former CEO and chairperson of the City Union Bank, was a banking genius. His vision helped City Union Bank spread its wings to the rest of India. The golden period which he heralded saw stupendous growth for the bank, and he was instrumental in making the bank technology friendly by introducing bank-wide computerization and installation of automatic teller machines. Some of the youngsters who are sitting here, if you think that ATMs are not as important and profound as we thought 30, 40 years ago, I'll tell you one small secret. There was a gentleman by name Paul Volcker, the former chairperson of the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, very tall person. And when he was asked in the new millennium after 2000, what was the best financial innovation in the last century? His answer was the automatic teller machine. That is the only thing he called as a very useful and worthwhile financial innovation in the banking industry. So the ATM might have become ubiquitous now, and we kind of take it for granted, but somebody like him saw that as the most important innovation in the banking space. So Mr. V. Narayanan oversaw the computerization installation of ATMs. During his times, the bank expanded beyond the temple town of Kumbakonam, and he first set up operations in cities such as Bangalore and Hyderabad. His leadership inspired the bank to make strides in spheres such as export credit, international money transfers, and depository activities. Mr. Narayanan perhaps saw City Union Bank as a lifetime investment when he said, "Take care of the bank will take care of you." The returns of the investment he made continue to benefit, help, and guide City Union Bank as it grows from strength to strength under the leadership of his able and competent son. Therefore, it is indeed an honor for me to be chosen to deliver his 17th memorial lecture. Dr. Vaidya was he and I were talking a couple of weeks ago about the title for the speech. If he had known that the Silicon Valley Bank was going to fail, he would have given me a different topic. But when he gave me the topic, it was still a thriving institution rated very highly by credit rating agencies who come in after the fact to tell us the bank has indeed failed. But let us keep that aside for the moment. And he said, given that India today has the presidency of G20, which lasts for about a year and continues until November 30th, and the theme of the Indian G20 presidency is Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam, he said, let us try and marry economic thoughts and economic policy with Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam. That is your topic. What do you think about it? I said, that sounds a bit intimidating. And as a true academic, he proceeded to give me some hints also. Just as you students ask the faculty member himself or herself for some important points for the exam, I did the same thing with him. What are the important points you want me to highlight in this speech? And he was very kind enough to share his thoughts. And I must say, his outline or thoughts have guided me in preparing for this talk. So therefore, I owe a special thanks to him. Let us first understand the origin of the concept and India's application of this principle of Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam. Eons ago, the Mahapanishad professed the wisdom that the world is one large family. But keeping aside the spiritual connotations of non-duality, because everybody and everything is one, in its literal sense, this phrase translates towards celebrating humanity beyond borders. If I keep spirituality aside for a moment, in practical terms, it celebrates humanity beyond borders. Today, as India heralds the G20 summit in September, negotiating key economic issues and facilitating convergence of viewpoints from all parts of the globe, our ethos of Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam stands true to its essence. Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam encapsulates the paradigm of viewing the whole world and its ecosystem as an extension of ourselves. This is in stark contrast to the anthropocentric philosophies preached elsewhere in the world, where the man is viewed as the pinnacle of natural creation. Our scriptures often show wisdom flowing from all living beings, birds, animals, and trees. We celebrate the ecosystem that we inhabit through festivals and rituals that bow down to the divinity in all living creatures. That is the philosophical meaning of this phrase. It is not just that the world is one family, it goes beyond that. Let's now come to the idea of economics or economic thoughts in Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam. A world economy that is based on this concept or principle will meet the needs of all people within the meaning of this living planet, within the means of this living planet, so that we and the rest of the nature can thrive together. The sweet spot that countries occupy is one where the need to live a life of dignity and opportunity are met without compromising on the capacity of the ecosystem, the ecology, and the environment that meets these needs. The reality, of course, is different. The World Inequality Report 2022 shows that we have regressed to the early 20th century levels of inequality, with 50% of the world's population having access to only 2% of world's output. This inequality is further compounded when climate change and global warming are more severe in countries which are developing or underdeveloped and which have had the least to contribute to the problem that they are facing. Therefore, a one-size-fits-all approach will not work if we are to tackle the global issues. This recognition of the limitation of one-size-fits-all approach in economics is the starting point for Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam. But let us step back and ask ourselves, how feasible is this concept to be implemented in today's world? We all understand that it is highly desirable, that all of us think of the world as an extension of ourselves. But how feasible, no matter how desirable it is? Is this a viable ideology? Well, I would like to play devil's advocate since there are lots of young minds here. And I would like to bring to you two arguments that question the feasibility of Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam to put in practice, even if it is, as I said, it is desirable. Firstly, much as we would like to believe, cooperation, unfortunately, is not the norm in human behavior, but competition is. The urge to exert dominance, display accomplishment, and power comes naturally to human beings. Cooperation is often seen as opportune and necessary when the situation at hand cannot be performed alone by oneself. Then we seek cooperation. History is replete with examples where competition eventually gave way to cooperation when all other options were exhausted to compete and to win. The most recent one I can think of in the COVID time is vaccine nationalism, which took over the developed world. While developed nations competitively secured vaccines in the early stages of the pandemic, many poor nations were left with very little. In fact, those of you who study game theory, you will know that the solution to the classical prisoner's dilemma is never cooperation, even when the payoffs are higher for cooperative outcomes. In fact, the same vaccine nationalism is now going to play out in front of our own eyes as you grow in terms of competition for rare earths and critical mineral elements when it comes to renewable energy. Nations are forming clubs together, keeping aside tens and hundreds of small and developing nations, while a small club of rich countries try to secure the supply of rare earths and critical minerals that are needed for producing renewable energy in the next 20 to 50 years. So we see this play out repeatedly, no matter how many times we hear cooperation is win-win, competition is win-lose, but human tendency is to first go towards competition and only then think of cooperation later. The second reason why I think Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is desirable but not necessarily feasible is today, human beings have often conflated means for ends. I'll give you examples. Okay? The short run or the short-term thinking we all have today, the means to get to a solution often assume larger role than the end goals that we seek to achieve. In other words, the means have become the ends. I'll give you many examples. Power was a means to serve, and today securing power is a goal in itself. For companies, profits were a signal of performance. Today, profits by any means has become the goal. Sports was a means to fitness, but winning in sports has become the goal in itself. Proficiency in exams was the goal. Proficiency in the subjects that you study was the goal. Exams were the means. But today, simply doing well in exams has become the goal. Proficiency and knowledge acquisition have become secondary. Let's come down to even more simpler ones. Cars were a means of conveyance, getting from point A to point B. But today, owning cars has become an end in itself because it is a prestige and status statement. Let's take gadgets. Gadgets were conveniences. Gadgets are statements of your status also like cars. Medicines treated illnesses, but today, illnesses are created to generate medicines. Television showed us what is happening elsewhere. Today, television dictates what happens. Outcomes generated rewards, but today, rewards generate or dictate outcomes. If you don't know what I'm talking about, think of sports betting and match fixing. Okay? Take social media. In social media, posts generated likes. Today, likes generate posts. In television, TRPs were a reflection of reporting quality. Now, TRPs are the goals in themselves, and there is an incentive to create gossip or news for TRPs. Technology was an aid to development. Today, technology is considered development in itself, and the casualties are employment and social stability. I end my illustrative list here. But what are the consequences of these? Confusion between means and ends in human beings and societies. There are at least 4 consequences. We end up pursuing everything to the point of maximum disgust. Quantity is valued over quality. Morality and ethics take a dive. Winning becomes everything. No long-term relationships between humans and within societies. And it is all about instant gratification. It is me versus the rest. In personal terms, the consequences are stress, restlessness, and no peace of mind. This is the very antithesis of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. This competition and the confusion of means for ends is antithetical to the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. However, that doesn't mean we should stop striving for a better world and to implement this concept, embrace the principle, and try to live according to it. What shall we do? Cooperation does indeed happen when incentives are created and a strong leadership exists to ensure the achievement of desired outcomes. For example, a strong incentive for multilateralism between countries was international trade. The world was viewed as one large marketplace. But when the strained geopolitical times of today arrived, we see capitalist countries and firms resort to friend-shoring and near-shoring, and international trade has become somewhat of a casualty now. This is proof that capitalism can deglobalize as much as it globalized our world. A new set of incentives are required, which can propel multilateralism again. What is the way to promote international trade, which is what brings people together? Trade requires trust. Trust requires dialogue. And that is the theme of the Indian G20 presidency. Trade requires trust. Trust requires dialogue. And forums like G20 enable nations to come together, have conversations inside and outside the convention halls. The very fact that India is taking the G20 presidency to more than 50 cities around the country means we will have to converse with the foreigners, get to know them better, and they get to know India better. So even as conversations become more difficult and more strained, paradoxically, that is when we have to make the maximum possible effort. In other words, we can bring in this principle of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam by continuing to create avenues and use those avenues for conversations, for dialogue, and better understanding. It is necessary and possible not only between nations, but also between humans and institutions. A concrete example of seeing the world as an extended version of oneself and one that reflects trust lies in the true significance of this phrase. Some of you might have heard of it. Common but differentiated responsibility, CBDR. Some of you who study climate, environment, who have learned about the Paris Agreement would have heard of the phrase CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities principle between developed and developing nations when it comes to tackling climate change. A family situation illustrates this idea very well. All the working members of the family support the younger ones in their growth and upbringing and evolution. Of course, each family member has the common goal of the welfare of the family, but responsibilities to the household vary. A child only needs to study. Adults are the breadwinners. In a similar sense, in this climate change, the developed countries are the adults, and small, vulnerable, and developing countries are like children. The global south, which is developing countries, account for far less emissions than the developed world. For example, India has contributed only 4% in the cumulative global emissions from 1850 until 2019. That's more than 170 years nearly. And it has maintained its per capita emission at a rate far less than the world average. As developing countries catch up on their development agenda, there is a need for technology and know-how transfer from the developed world for climate mitigation. This is how you embrace everybody in this common goal. So developed countries have to do their bit to transfer knowledge, technology, and resources. More importantly, like elders in the family allow the children to grow while they do their breadwinning, global south developing countries should be allowed to grow by investing in climate adaptation, climate resilience, rather than in mitigating greenhouse gas emission. That responsibility should primarily be with the developed world, and they should let the developing world grow to a size whereby they can raise the resources needed for tackling emissions and then the related challenges later after they have grown to a particular income level. I want to highlight to you what Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling said in 1992. He won the Nobel Prize in 2005. He said, if per capita income growth, he wrote in 1992, if per capita income growth in the next 40 years compares with the 40 years just went by, vulnerability to climate change will diminish and the resources for adaptation will be greater. I say this not to minimize concerns about climate change, but to anticipate the question of whether developing countries should make sacrifices in their development to minimize the emission of gases that may change the climate to their disadvantage. In fact, their best defense against climate change may be their own continued development. So he battled for developed countries, allowing developing countries to grow first before imposing obligations on them. That is an example of how we actually implement Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And India offers a way out in this. For many years, all of you might know, India was second to China in the unenviable largest population on earth position. Even then, comparisons were always there. Can India become the next China? Can the elephant tame the dragon? These questions have become important, especially with India poised to surpass China to become the world's most populous nation. Countries like ours have to necessarily leverage as well as battle their own civilizational history, socio-politics, and their neighbors to chart out a path that best serves their purpose. Money was and is important, but the path to acquiring money and wealth may not be the same. What has worked for most nations is the push to plain and simple economics that rewards man's natural self-interest and society's desire to advance itself. And that is why even today, a country's development is largely measured by GDP, the three bright letters that signify economic progress. But then mere economic growth is not enough. It is the manner and the sustainability of the economic growth that becomes important. The balance between economic growth and the country's social consonants that go with it. The better this instrument is tuned, the sweeter the music. The more anchored a country is in its domestic values, the better it can weather global storms. For example, the global recession of 2008 was a major shock. And today we have multiple small crises happening around us, thanks to the 2 years of pandemic that closed borders, set off ripples whose all-round effects cannot be confidently documented even to date. The waves of nationalism, domestic reliance, foreign suspicion, a closer look at tourism dependence, all these things are now being questioned. Look at Sri Lanka, for example. It is emerging from a near bankruptcy. It was a middle-income country 4 years ago. It is now poised to become a low-income country. It's a demotion. Pakistan is heading into a crisis, and Russia is engaged in a war no one around the world imagined would stretch for so long, more than a year now. It is in this context that India has inherited a spotlight position. Despite the loss of jobs, the recession bullet has just scraped our skin and went past. India escaped largely unscathed. Even the COVID pandemic left India still standing on its feet, even if the ground was shaken somewhat. 2 years after the pandemic, we have now managed to walk the tightrope with a delicate balancing act. For example, recovering to pre-pandemic levels thanks to massive investment in infrastructure like your institution has done. The central capex spending in 2023-24 is expected to be roughly 4 times what it was 8 years ago. Capital expenditure by the government is 4 times what it was 8 years ago. And the government has managed to stay away, or rather shield India from the negative effects of the Russian-Ukraine war. The Indian government has inherited the G20 presidency, and that is a very timely occurrence. And in a fitting but dramatic irony, India recently crossed its erstwhile colonial master, the UK, to take its position as the world's 5th largest economy. So we are in a good spot to actually play the role of the propagator and the instigator of the idea and the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, because our neutrality and economic resilience are the 2 important pillars on which this edifice of global trust can be built. India's growth also has been like that of the proverbial turtle that kept to its own path and outperformed many confident hares. What has been the notable feature of India's growth is its commitment to its values. And that is why in the new world view of the last few years, our international repute and respectability have grown like never before. For example, in the last 8 years, India first concentrated domestically to help better quality of life based on metrics which may or may not be in line with global indicators, but they are unique to India. For example, it's again a very brave and unheard of push to Swachh Bharat. The government provided on focusing universal access to toilets. This is a fact that cannot be registered or marked by any global indicator of development, but this helped break many development barriers, indirectly awarding women a special political, economic, and social place. Focusing on saturation of basic services of home, like toilets, utilities, energy, as a policy to reduce inequality in kind, even though it may not be in income terms. The pandemic offered us an opportunity to reassess our economic policies. This Atmanirbhar Bharat has come about. Domestic strengthening and increased spending on infrastructure were a consequence of our Atmanirbhar Bharat policy. Now, after having placed India on a solid domestic footing, we now looked internationally. We looked outside our borders, helping the weaker and smaller nations with vaccine diplomacy. A significant portion of it was gifted, automatically assuming the role of a leader in this part of the world. In economic terms, the International Monetary Fund projects India to be the fastest growing economy in 23-24 as well as in 24-25. We are also innovating, a characteristic of free, aspirational, and confident people. The technology adoption in India was brought about by the public sector, not the private sector as in developed countries. With the unified payments interface and the bouquet of digital public infrastructure, e-rupee, e-way bill, and the TRED system for micro, small, and medium enterprises, the government is actually chugging the digital engine. Jan Dhan Yojana, Aadhaar, and mobile, the JAM Trinity, helped actual beneficiaries get their intended and deserved eligible benefits. All this has smoothened life in the country and its development at a scale not known by many of our global peers. Even today, we are all amazed by the ease of payments and the doorstep availability of services through multiple providers at ease and convenience not even available in several advanced countries. Now that we are confident, we are also embracing many of our old values, fleeing from the Western notions of growth thrust upon us. It throws open many questions. Is our old friend, the Gini coefficient, the best approximation of inequality because it measures income differences? Or is the foreign definition of poverty the best approximation of a person's living status? Is a person living on so-called less than $2 per day, but grows his own food and barters his produce with his neighbor, should he be considered poor? Many rural Indians and Africans live in self-sustaining or local sustaining climes where even without exchange of money, all that is relevant for life is available. The quality of his life, the purity of the air he breathes, free from urban afflictions, are not factored in these indicators like Gini coefficient and $2 per day poverty line. Today, we are saddled with newfound words whose meanings and uses are again defined by Western constructs. Should we not use the opportunity of our new position in the world and our rising self-esteem to send some ideas back to the world? Again, for example, take sustainability. It often seems funny to me and to many of my friends that American corporations are talking about sustainability. If there is one country in the world that is intrinsically sustainable, it is India. Our ancient texts say, Shashvatam Prakriti Manav Sankatam, Sankatam Khalu Shashvatam, means relationship between ecology, environment, and man are eternal and nourishing. Our practices are inherently sustainable. We use a cloth to wipe our kitchens clean instead of tissue papers. We do not use water-based cleaning systems. We reuse almost every household item. We coexist with animals. And even our ancient home remedies of pest control focused on deviation rather than killing them. This is not even taught. It is actually imbibed, learned, and passed on to future generations. The small sachet sold in rural India as compared to the large tumblers that you find in Western societies are a clear distinction of and a clear marker of how a low wastage economy ours is. Therefore, it is incumbent on all of us not to lose sight of these ancient inherited qualities and attributes, even as we look up to the Western standards of living, because some of which came with unsustainability attached to them. Take, for example, health. It is a great economic contributor, and India is losing many of its virtues. If you look at the National Family Health Survey number 5, which came out in 1920, obesity in urban India has increased among women, among men, among low income, among high income, among educated, among uneducated. Why? We have chosen to consume the fast snack foods that the Western palate has constructed for us or made for us. We have given up our traditional food and the way we integrated physical activity into our daily chores. And more than that, We have something to give back to the world, even in treatment, let alone prevention of disease. For that, we must first start believing in them. Ayurveda, or the emphasis on existence in accordance with nature, emphasis on prevention rather than cure, are natural remedies rather than clinical supplements with a very unclear understanding of their long-term damage. We need to abandon it and embrace our natural remedies instead of consuming chemicals whose after effects and side effects, and for the period unknown, we have no conceptual understanding. In general, as Dr. Vaidya pointed out in his initial remarks, we are great savers and frugal spenders. One of my friends said, who came back by a train from Lucknow last week, she had to bring her aunt from Lucknow to Delhi. And apparently the aunt was incredulous. Why you would book a second AC train berth when a third AC berth looks just fine? The point to learn here is, it is not the savings or the frugality, but the emphasis on less wastage. We live our life in a way that we don't convert our wants into needs. That is living well, but harmoniously. In many of these matters, we are actually similar to our Asian friends in China, Japan, Malaysia, Myanmar, and even Russia than to the West. The civilizational baton is passed down to families and is integrated with the more modern ways of living. The connection with the past is important as we navigate the challenges of today. It is that connection that gives us conviction to do the right thing. In short, the crossroads that the world finds itself in today with respect to climate change, with respect to environmental damage, with respect to limitless consumption, is an opportunity for India not only to rediscover its values, but to share that with the rest of the world, because that is what is about embracing the world as one family. And that is what is about making the world sustainable and safer for future generations. Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam doesn't stop with the current generation. It extends beyond generations. We would rather not leave behind debt for the future generations. We would rather leave behind for them a legacy of which we should be first aware and be proud, so that keeps the planets, the humans, the nature, and all living organisms living harmoniously with one another. From a macro perspective, our economy may have started benefiting from efficiency gains from greater formalization, financial inclusion. I mentioned the JAM Trinity, digital technology, which you're all using on a daily basis. But we're also beginning to enjoy our moment in history. We need to seize that with confidence. Confidence comes from awareness of our own heritage, our own traditions, our own knowledge. From that confidence, it is time to take the leap of faith. Stronger economic branches and stronger civilizational roots are the keys that would unlock Vasudhaiva Kudumbakam, not just for India, but for everybody in this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for such a scholarly analysis of a topic that sounded to be a little abstract when I gave it to him, but then the way in which he has molded the topic, handling different issues and the serious research that he has done to present a very interesting view on how we need to look at various metrics of development and how India has the potential to redefine the metrics of growth, moving away from the conventional Gini coefficient or the way in which poverty has been defined. And these are all various dimensions that, bundled together to form a very interesting perspective. And if students and faculty can unbundle that to pick small units of a speech, each of them has the potential to become a large thesis. And that's the summary of what he has delivered by way of this 17th Narayanan Memorial Lecture. And a big round of applause to Dr. Van. And he has graciously accepted to also take a few questions. We have 20 minutes for the Q&A. And it's time for you to ask the questions, and then I reserve the exclusive right to ask the last question. So when I ask the last question, it means that the Q&A session is over. So let's begin. If you have a question, please raise your hand. There are volunteers with a microphone, so we'll start with the girl student there. And make it a short question, no observations, no comments, no question paper, just question.
So first of all, it's honor, sir, to listen to your speech. So my question is, de-dollarization and Sanatan economics or Sanatan Arthashastra, they are the buzzword these days. So India's G20 leadership among crisis. So what do you think? Will India be able to achieve these goals?
I must compliment you for that question. But along with Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, we must also have one more attribute that will serve us well, which is patience. Statecraft and goals that we want to pursue for not only ourselves and for the world must be combined with patience and the awareness to strike when the opportunity is ripe. Right now, while the collapse of some financial institutions, etc., might make us feel that de-dollarization is imminent, it is not. Today's developed countries took 150 odd years to get to where they are. And while some aspects of their growth we can fast forward and learn to fire from their shoulders, some elements we have to wait for the time to arrive. So it is not just what the great Lord Krishna said to Arjuna. It is also true for nations, not only for individuals. We just have to keep plugging away with our efforts and what we think is the right thing to do. The outcomes will take care of themselves when the right moment arrives.
Please raise your hand. Yes, sir. Mr. Mahalingam.
It has been a wonderful lecture, Anant, actually. Listening to you has been a pleasure all the time. Just a simple question. I think you brought in a profound idea that consumption is not the ultimate thing in an economy. Should we not even look at even GDP growth is not an ultimate in an economy, because GDP growth is based on consumption, and consumption results in a huge amount of waste. It is not compatible with greening the economy at all. How do you actually reconcile the whole thing? I mean, should we not start a different type of calibration of the economy rather than GDP growth? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mahalingam. So, the answer is somewhat layered and may not be 100% satisfactory to you. So I have to start with that disclaimer. When we propose alternative metrics, since we have to combine that with an element of recognition of the power balance between nations, we should do it when we are in a position of strength. So right now, if we propose an alternative metric, it should not be construed by other nations as an excuse for non-performance on the growth metric. So that is one, that is the timing of it is important. And second, just as you must be very familiar that in the foreign exchange market, a country should intervene when already the positioning is aligned in your direction. When the positioning in the developed world discourse is aligned in our direction, that is when we should strike. And third, I would say instead of trying to replace GDP with other metrics, we should now start to supplement it with metrics that will eventually then serve as a springboard for a more comprehensive indicator. And I must also concede that we look at GDP not only because it is compact, even though we know the limitation that it served a world in which manufacturing was more dominant, where things could be counted easily. But it also happens to correlate well with other things that we like to have, such as life expectancy, lower infant mortality, lower maternal live birth mortality. All these things do correlate very well. And even if you take the so-called gross national happiness index, it has coincided with higher per capita incomes. There is a correlation. So what I'm trying to say is, to some extent, we should be very careful about abandoning it while recognizing its limitations. My answer, therefore, right now is GDP is like is like how we call democracy. It is the worst form of government, but for everything else. Similarly, GDP is the worst form of economic measurement, but for everything else. So that is the current attitude I would like to have. Yeah.
Yes, Professor.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful and thought-provoking lecture. In fact, when our neighboring economies are crying for their mere survival, India is eyeing for a very big leap in terms of moving towards a bigger economic development. The proof is how we have advanced from the 10th to 5th largest economy. Sir, what are your predictions for the next rise of India? Next rise of India.
You must have obviously not heard that an economist is very good in explaining why his forecast made the day before for yesterday did not come true. So in asking an economist for a forecast, you are forgetting this important point that we are very good at explaining why our forecast didn't come true rather than being able to make the right forecast. So you have to keep that caveat in your head first. And the reason why economic forecasts are not exactly similar to the kind of predictions you would make in, let's say, physical sciences, because these are conditional statements. What we say, a forecast of particular outcome is subject to a lot of factors which do not remain constant. So, for example, let's take the most recent example of the Silicon Valley Bank that has collapsed in the last 2-3 days. So in 2018, the United States was also raising interest rates like it has done in 2022 and 23 so far. The United States interest rates went from 0 to 2.5% in 2018, and the economy began to wobble. They stopped at 2.5%. And 2019, they reduced interest rates, and then the pandemic happened. It went to 0 again. This time, they had raised interest rates to 4.75%, and nothing seemed to have happened. I was wondering, and I used to write even before I came to this office in Mint, that I do not expect the US economy to withstand interest rates of more than 3%. That's one warning for you. So it has withstood until 4.75% before things turned turkey. So my point is, we may not get the timing right. We may not get the direction right, because other factors come into play. So economists' forecast should be treated as just points of departure, a placeholder. So where we are and where we are likely to go towards is also dependent on what I said at the very beginning on the availability of critical minerals and rare earths for renewable energy. If we have to move away from fossil fuels, because fossil fuels, the burning of coal, oil, petrol, diesel helped today's developed countries achieve their economic growth. And we are not going to experience and enjoy the same privilege. Our financial institutions may not be allowed to finance coal-fired power plants going forward. And we still need to invest in fossil fuel-based power plants. We can't avoid that. But how are we going to be allowed to finance it? Which developed countries were able to do with impunity when they were growing. So taking all that thing into consideration and assuming that the geopolitical situation does not worsen in the next several years. And there again, it comes with a warning, because many people who look at these long-term trends say 1945 was the end of World War II, and we have gone through 80 years of relative peace at a world level. So they say that this is now the time for conflicts to re-emerge, because the world goes through cycles, right? So considering all of that, I think there is a very good chance by the end of the decade, assuming any of these things don't become major crisis points, we should be the third largest economy in the world by the end of the decade. And in absolute terms, I think, and I've been saying this in many forums, to get to $7 trillion by 2030 is not unrealistic. It's a realistic possibility. So with all these caveats, I've given you the answers. I'm sure, hopefully, both of us can recheck in 2030.
As to the student there, and then we'll come to Mr. Sridharan. Here, the student there. Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Kalidaran. I'm from the law department here. So you mentioned that how with time we have started confusing means for the ends. And is there a way out of this confusion? Is there a way out of this confusion on an individual level and on a national level?
That's a good question. Sometimes the mere awareness of us doing certain things is a great starting point. And the moment you become aware that you are chasing means as the goals in themselves, the next time you do so, your mind will automatically warn you. Subconsciously, it goes to work. Subconscious goes to work, even when you are sleeping. So the more you become aware, and that is where the redemption starts. But then at the societal level, that's at the individual level. And if more individuals become aware, it becomes a social phenomena as well. But obviously, social phenomena move slowly, right? It takes time for it to happen. And those who are aware, for example, take the number of cricket matches being played today. Quantity has become more important because television drives cricket rather than cricket being telecast. Cricket's matches are being played for being telecast. So that's exactly what I mean by saying conflation of means and ends. I gave you multiple examples. So the more we people exercise our awareness and rights as consumers, and that requires discipline, okay? Not to patronize situations where there is a conflation of means and ends, then that is the kind of messaging that people who have commercial goals will also realize, will also heed, right? So in other words, we should be prepared to let go of certain things which we are being told by society are important. So for example, you must have heard of instant gratification and delayed gratification. So if we can practice delayed gratification, that is also one of the means in which this can be reversed. But I am realistic about all this happening. But the more people like you ask questions like this and start to become aware, that is where the path to a better future and less confusion between means and end, that is where it begins. That is where the journey begins. Thank you.
Mr. Sridharan, one question. That's the cap.
Thank you, sir. That was a very inspiring and interesting talk. I am Dr. Sridhar, a member of the board of COB and a former civil servant. You mentioned that India has been showing the way to the rest of the world by virtue of its commitment to values. And I think Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is one of those values which we cherish and we practice also. Now, are these values national values or universal values? If they are universal values, why is it that only some countries practice it, especially the developing ones, and not the rest of them? And if they are national values, then can values be differing from country to country?
Absolutely. They are not yet universal values because the Western world is linear in construct, whereas we are cyclical in construct. And they have placed the individual at the center, which I mentioned earlier in my remarks, whereas we place the community and the society at the center. And there are people like Joseph Heinrich, who wrote this book about the West, about the weird societies. I think they have tried to analyze that there are intrinsic cultural differences. But even in the West, some of these phenomena are not very long in nature. They are somewhat recent in nature. And some of it is attributed to the influence of the church. Some of it is attributed to the how by banning marriages within the family between cousins, it forced Western societies to go and look outside their initial clan or the tribe. They slowly created the primacy of the individual rather than the clan or the tribe, etc. So it is not in that sense universal, and it may have gone quite far in one direction for it to row back in the other direction. But ultimately, the way in which people will embrace these values on their own is through demonstration effect. If we can continue to embrace these values and not succumb to the temptation of showing that we are succeeding by their metrics, we should have the self-confidence to say we are succeeding based on our metrics, and our standards of living and the improvement are there for you to see. We don't have to follow your metrics. And then we also, whenever the opportunities arise, we demonstrate these values ourselves within the community of nations in the neighborhood and elsewhere. Then there is a possibility, there is no guarantee, of course, that these national values become universal values.
Shanta?
Thanks for a thought-provoking and interesting, inspiring speech. A question to test again an economist's capability of prediction. Now, you are talking about the interest rate increase in cycle and said that in US cannot stand more than 3%. Now it has stood up to 4.5. According to you, where we are standing today at the interest rate cycle?
Dr. Vaidya said in his initial remarks, he said, welcome to friends and members of the media.
No, I'm not from the media.
No. Maybe you are not the media, but there could be others. So therefore, I'm not going to... I
in that
because I just spoke about delayed gratification, so I'm not going to take the bait.
Okay, offline during lunch. Okay. So from the lady faculty there, that will be the penultimate question. Sorry, we are running short of time, and then I'll ask the last question.
Thank you for that inspiring speech, sir. India is rich in its culture and values. And we have been living with these values. We may not be very conscious about how we live and the guidelines, what we take from the rich scriptures, what we have. If India is rich in its culture, values, everything, by now there should have been an Indian model which showcases to the world about these values which guide the growth and development of any nation. Do you think India has remained very humble, or it has not preached enough, or is it something like the age-old tradition where only the seeker can find it and it should not be preached? Is it taking any stance like that? And isn't it a time where we should also let the other part of the world know that there is an answer for these things? Why there is a delay? Where is the lack?
That should be the theme of the 18th Narayanan Memorial Lecture. Because it's very difficult to answer that question in a short sentence in the time that we have. Therefore, I will not be doing justice by giving a very short answer, but let me simply state it is both a function of confidence and as well as demonstrated success over a long period before we can start spreading our doctrine. In other words, we are swayed by the material success of the Western world, and therefore we think we should embrace and practice those values because that is what got them success. That is what we think. Exactly. So the point is, we do not appreciate enough that in their early years of success, they actually weren't practicing what they are practicing today. They themselves weren't practicing what they are practicing today. What they are practicing today is making their own success unsustainable. So to be able to enunciate something, we need to believe in it ourselves. and we need to have the confidence to be able to articulate it. Humility by per se is not wrong. If anything, I think we need to simply let the achievements speak for themselves rather than, being propagators. Ultimately, people are going to accept it even if it faces initial resistance, if it suits their self-interest. So continued adherence to what we believe in and demonstrating success with those values will be enough advertisements and propagation for our values to become universal. But as I said, this is a very, very incomplete answer. It's a very profound question. So we should do it for the next memorial lecture. Thank you.
So mindful of your media consciousness, I actually had a provocative question. So I'll have it offline. So I'll sacrifice my question and I'll allow Dr. Badri to ask the question. Last question.
Good afternoon, sir. Thanks to CUB and Shastra for organizing this intellectual feast every year. We are all very grateful. My question is that we are doing every year the economic survey. What is the role of academic institution like us in participating in this economic survey? Why don't you crowdsource, democratize the process of the preparation of economic survey? If such an opportunity is given, we at Shastra are ready to participate in that great national event. Thank you.
It's a very worthwhile suggestion. Conceptually, it is very sound, but obviously in practical terms, what happens is it's an enormous choice set available to us for us to choose from. And then it becomes somewhat discretionary in nature, which could be interpreted as being somewhat arbitrary in nature. So there is a fine line between the two. So we have to find the balance between the two, whom we choose to, whom we reach out to and get what. But I would say that if there are some interesting research or case studies in your incubators or in your different fields that are there, you should, in fact, I encourage you, I even request you to share it with me. And we have included several things as box items, 1-page, 2-page stories within in the chapters on infrastructure or climate or industry. So definitely you should do so, because we may not be aware unless they are brought to our attention. We may not be able to even know. So I encourage you to use your own achievements and advancements in several areas. If some of the success stories from your incubatee companies are something that can be included, for example, I'm just illustratively saying that you should do so. I encourage you to do so. So it's a very worthwhile suggestion. We will do our best. Yeah.
Thank you very much. A big round of applause for taking the questions.
The number of questions stand testimony to what a thought-provoking lecture this has been. So thank you, sir, for that. I now request Dr. N. Kamakodi, MD and CEO, City Union Bank, to propose the vote of thanks.
On behalf of Chairman, board members, CUBians, family members of Shri V. Narayanan, and my own behalf, let me thank Dr. Ananta Nageshwaran, Chief Economic Advisor, for this thought-provoking and scintillating address. And we have been hearing lectures. This one stands apart, particularly, like say, the way things got connected between the listeners and the orator. So thank you very much for that address, sir. Let me also take this opportunity to thank Mrs. Ananta Nageshwaran for joining us today in this occasion. And our special thanks to Chancellor Shastra University, Vice Chancellor Dr. Vaidya Subramaniam, for arranging this lecture. And sir, you were asking to have 18th lecture with Dr. Vaidya Subramaniam. In fact, we have heard 17 lectures as a part of this every year. And his, like say, the setting the context had always been liked. And we, like say, in fact, almost equal to the main speaker, we listen to him because he sets the context in such a nice fashion. Thank you very much, Vaidya, for this wonderful setting the context, as always. A special thanks to faculty members, staff members, and students, Shastra University, who have come in large numbers and listened to this great lecture.
my special thanks to all of you. Thanks to press and media for joining this occasion. Once again, this particular lecture over the period of time, it has, Shastra has invited very eloquent and persons holding the important office. In fact, we had Shri Mahalingam, who delivered one of the earlier lectures as whole-time member SEBI. This is in fact, like say, setting the context, and also it ensures that the important persons are invited to this part of the world, so that we also get our Kaveri Delta get required focus in the overall scheme of things. Once again, I take this opportunity to thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I request all of you to kindly rise for the national anthem.
जनगण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जरति तरंगा तब शुभ नामे जाहे तव शुभ आशीष माहे गाहे तव जय गाथा जनगण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे।